Today's lecture on mapping. Actually, there is a change in the title: Masked Observers and Mass Collectors, Entangled Vision from the 18th Century Amazon. It's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Yusuf here. He is the Beatriz and Julio Matos Santo Domingo Director and Librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, with a joint appointment as Associate Professor in the Department of History at Brown University. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University and has held teaching and research appointments at the University of Michigan, the University of Pennsylvania, and most recently at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver. He is the author of Measuring the New World, Enlightenment, Science, and South America, which was awarded the 2009 Gilbert Turner Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies and the Institut Français d'Amérique, a Spanish translation, La Medición del Nuevo Mundo, is forthcoming from Marshall Plans in Madrid. His current research relates to the environment and ethnographic history of the Amazon River Basin and the Atlantic World during the Age of Revolutions. Thank you so much for attending, for coming, for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to have you here with us today, and now I turn the floor.
Great. Thank you, Aldair, and thank you all for coming. And my apologies for the last-minute change in the topic of the talk today. As I was just discussing with him, I hope to refer to some of the issues related to the mapping of the Amazon and some of these broader methodological questions during this presentation as well. But I happened to leave my laptop computer on my desk back in Providence, and I was planning to finish the cartographic presentation yesterday and yesterday evening. So I decided in lieu of that, I would give something that I'm also currently working on, but that has a little bit more finish to it, but that also deals with many of the same issues that I would have been talking about anyway. So I hope that you will forgive me. The other reason that I was inclined to give this presentation today rather than the one that I had originally proposed was that I had put in the title of the presentation, which I believe was Mapping Amazonian Nature, what 18th century cartography what cartography can tell us about 18th century ecology. And as I was working through the project, I realized that my answer to that was going to be not much. And I thought that rather than giving away the fact that maps are very complicated documents for trying to recover the history of the fascinating dynamics that existed between human populations and the natural environment in as dynamic and rich a space as the Brazilian, or broader speaking, the Amazon more generally. I thought that perhaps I could explore this through another case study that would help us to get at some of the source questions behind why it is that if we look at maps, we don't see what we are hoping to find in terms of answers to these questions. There are deeper methodological questions about the nature of evidence, about the symmetry of different sources that we use that I hope will be revealed in this talk. So I'm going to be speaking about mapping in a much more metaphorical vein, and in a sense putting Amazonian nature on the map for us through a focus on indigenous practices, which I hope you will see as being of fundamental importance for my presentation, and in particular visuality as a kind of a mechanism for understanding the processes that are underway. So if we look at European visual representations of others, which has been long a tradition in terms of understanding the history of the Americas, because it offers such a rich source base for us to do it. And in fact, at the John Carter Brown Library, we specialize in an area called European Americana, that is, the books that were written about the Americas from a European perspective, which is all of which are extremely valuable for the kind of work that we do. But I want to argue that in recent years, these kinds of books have come to be seen as somewhat inadequate in reconstituting the visual and symbolic cultures of the early Americas. It is rather the intersection and engagement, or the entanglement, to use another term, of many cultures and practices of visuality that can best reveal the particularities of different forms of knowledge in visual terms in particular. Although, again, it's not only, I'm going to be talking about visuality, but in many ways these kinds of entangled questions can be extrapolated to a lot of different areas. The transformation that has been underway for some time reminds me of the opening essay in the catalog of the Musée du Quai Branly's inaugural exposition, which was entitled D'un regard l'autre, that is to say, from one perspective, the other, in a very typically convoluted French manner. But in this essay, the museum's president, Stéphane Martin, opened with a quote from Denis Diderot's Supplément au voyage de Bougainville. Méfiez-vous de celui qui veut mettre de l'ordre. Beware of those who wish to put things in order. And yet, Martin takes the words of a Tahitian ventriloquized through a European satirist as the inspiration for an exhibition in which, in his words, one should not yield to the inclination to determine what a European vision is of the arts of other continents, but rather to take seriously the vision of those cultures that are being portrayed. So already you have the author of this essay who is stepping back to a fictional French author of a fictional account who is imitating what a Tahitian is to say as the methodological basis for the kind of move of switching the view from one to another. So I think what I'm implying here is that merely by saying the other is a capitalized figure that we should take seriously is not sufficient to give ample agency and voice to those who have been silenced and erased by idioms, graphic or otherwise, of the colonial process. And it's our job as historians to explore other options for integrating these visions into the colonial record. The historical record. So this is where material culture, or what the anthropologist Fernando Santos Granero calls the occult life of things, may play a crucial role in offering, if not unmediated reflections of the non-European gaze, then at least a less highly mediated version of those perspectives. And in thinking about materials, it helps us to think outside of the methodological box that we have access to as scholars who are primarily, or have traditionally been, focused around textual records. I've been particularly attracted to archaeology for this reason, especially for the work that I have been doing for some years now related to the deep history of the Amazon River region. In the past 2 decades, physical anthropologists and paleoecologists have radically transformed our understanding of lowland South America's human history, arguing for the historical presence of communities that would have rivaled the civilizations of the Incas and the Aztecs in terms of their technological prowess, in terms of their population, and in terms of, importantly, their engagement with the natural environment that surrounds them in the forest. Through material analyses of plant distribution, soil characteristics, stylistic features of pottery, and site locations of human, domestic, and mortuary remains, they've convincingly argued that native peoples of the tropical regions of South America were engaged proactively with the management of their local environments, planting trees, trees, cultivating species, domesticating animals, and organizing their domestic lives in direct relationship with the forests that surround them. It's in this spirit that I would like to orient my presentation today, by talking about the occult life of things with regard to the Amazonian populations in the 18th century and how they might be able to shed light on the ontologies of nature and visuality in the South American tropics. And because, again, the original thrust of this talk was going to be about cartography, I'd like you to keep in your mind the ways in which what I'm talking about from a visual or graphic perspective is also in many ways applicable to the map as an object that itself is an expression of different forms of collaboration between the European artist, between indigenous practitioners, between people who knew the land and the territory, and seeing these as an expression of that. We'll perhaps get a chance at the end to talk a little bit about that as well. Rather than starting in deep history, however, let's start on the banks of the Canaburi River at the Amazonian village of Caldas in December of 1785. This is, generally speaking, the area near the triple border between Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela. 2 years after returning to Portuguese America, the Brazilian-born and Portuguese-trained naturalist Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira arrived here as the leader of the most ambitious Portuguese expedition of natural historical collection and ethnographic observation that had been ever organized. It was called a viagem filosófica, or philosophical voyage, and he was accompanied by a botanist gardener, a coterie of Amerindian rowers, guides, and interpreters, and, as you can see from this image, two artists, José Joaquim Freire and Joaquim José Codina. Both Freire and Codina were part of a larger group of artists that had been trained specifically to accompany these scientific expeditions. And they would travel contemporaneously to places like Goa, Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, and Portuguese America, especially the Brazilian Amazon. I'm going to show you a slide in a moment which gives a kind of a visual record of this. But I just wanted to point out here that already in these amazing depictions of Amazonian landscape, we have certain aspects of the 18th century ecological engagement of the Portuguese and the indigenous communities, with trees that are cut down with a depiction of nature in particular ways. One of the things that has always struck me about looking at 18th century documents, about 18th century documents of the tropics, is in many ways their inability to express the complexity and diversity of the environments that they're trying to portray. It is almost as if, and I think this is relevant in asking questions about the kinds of source materials that we use and what maps can tell us about 18th century ecology as an example, because it seems that they do not have the graphic language, the graphic idioms, to be able to express certain kinds of landscape portrayals, for instance, the kind of a sense that maybe 20 or 30 years later, in some of the early German expeditions, for instance, to Brazil, you already see coming out much more directly. You see Humboldt talking about the way in which one can depict the tropics, the kinds of techniques that are going to be used. But here, there seems to be a kind of a restraint. And so this is, again, when we're talking about, we can never take a document like this and treat it as a kind of a legitimate representation of what it actually looked like, because there are technical skills and technical capacities that need to be considered. And the other thing, and we'll see this in just a moment, about the nature of maps in particular, is at the very moment that these cartographic productions are being made, there is a movement of other information away from the map that used to be a container for indigenous depictions of indigenous groups and different kinds of features of cultural life onto other kinds of what I call spatial repositories, repositories of spatially derived information. It's probably the best way to do it. I'll show an example of that in just a moment. So again, what I want you to be thinking about is the way in which in the 18th and especially then into the 19th century, information starts getting parsed out in different ways and ends up in different repositories, all of which are relevant for our understanding of the region. So going back then to the production of this knowledge, and here you have an example of Alexandre Rodriguez Ferreira, the Amerindian rowers, the isolation or perceived isolation of the erudite European in his boat, and also here you can again see the depiction of a certain kind of landscape framework and a landscape tradition that may or may not be actually a legitimate representation of the kinds of species that exist there. Here is an example of one of the different kinds of activities that scientific travelers would engage in during their visit. This was produced back in Europe as an example, almost like a guidebook for expeditionaries who would go out. Here you have the riscador or sketch artist. You see here the tools of the trade, which often included portable libraries, which is another topic dear to my heart that I'm hoping to pursue in the future. The collection of specimens here. This is another kind of specimen, and all of these other activities, again, engaging with certain aspects of the nature, but ultimately showing that all of these, this is all part of a broader effort to capture the information in both graphic and material ways from the expeditions. So Ferreira's arrival at the Canavuri River had brought him and his coterie into the land of the Yuripichunas, a group whom Ferreira described as humble Indians who were subject to the white Europeans. Other indigenous groups had given them the name Yuripichunas because of the ritual scarifications that they practiced in adolescence. Yuru, meaning mask, Pichuna, meaning black. But in his first encounter with the Yuripichunas, Ferreira described them not in terms of their relationship to colonial culture, nor in terms of other indigenous groups, but rather with reference to a performance that he had been witness to while traveling through their territory. I observed as much as I might desire in order to understand the form and motivation of the dances I had seen, he wrote in the report that he had following his visit, and from what I understood of them, I am able to provide the following explanation. Ferreira's explanation focused on two features of the natives' dramatic display. In the first case, he was intrigued by the way the Yuripichunas constructed elaborate facial coverings for their use in rituals, benefiting from colored dyes and other natural fabrics to build physical masks that covered up the facial scars for which they were more widely known. They molded these masks into symbolic forms appropriate to the particular rites they were performing. Large fish heads were employed when the river's offerings had been particularly generous. A great boar's head when the hunt had gone smoothly, and other less discernible shapes as well, which Ferreira described as mere caprices of their enthusiasm without a real object to which they might correspond. By the way, all of these masks are part of the museological collection in Coimbra in Portugal, and are part of the broader collection of Alexandre Rodriguez Ferreira's journey. In order to construct construct these masks, the Europeanas applied ochre, urupum, also known as the anato plant, and paste from the seeds of the carajuru plant, carefully working the natural fabric so that they would comfortably fit on the heads of their wearers. Armed with these tints and colors and with ample artistic license, the Europeanas were thus able to decorate and ready these objects for their performative use. It was not, however, the masks that most transfixed Fajitas' attention, but the dance itself, which he described through the ethnographic filters of his own gaze. The dance we observed was a bona fide theatrical scene in which the military campaigns of the Indians were represented as if one were watching the departure of the army and its march toward the land of the Europeanas' enemies. One can see the precautions they take as they build their camp, the astute manner in which they place some divisions in ambush, the way they surprise their enemy, the tumult and ferociousness of the combat, and the triumph of their victories. The actors who appear on stage race to occupy their posts with such ardor and such enthusiasm, with so many gestures and facial expressions, that to us Europeans who were observing them, it was difficult to believe that what we were seeing was merely a dress rehearsal and not actual combat. Fajitas' recounting of these Sylvan theatrics of the Europeanas is, of course, itself also a form of theatricality, a representation of his own observational skills and how certain scenes in Amazonia challenge the limits of European perception in understanding them. But Fajita also realized that the Europeana dance, far from being a divertissement, also performed a very important function for the Europeana, and that it involved, quote, every aspect of their public and private life. Yet he still remained unsure what was real and what was fictive in this performative display. So we can use Fajita's observations and musings on this ritual performance to take us in several different directions as we seek to understand both how Europeans came to understand the behaviors of local Amazonian populations and how those same Amazonian populations sought to understand the outsiders that were watching them perform. In the first instance, they bring us closer to the work of contemporary anthropologists who have seen in Amazonian masks the awakening of a system of transformations that can hide, reveal, or create new ritual characters. Here I'm thinking specifically about the work of Aristoteles Barcelos Neto, whose reading of the masks from the Wauja communities of the Upper Xingu demonstrate how masks actually serve as actors in a transformational drama that goes through multiple ontological stages. That is, the masks themselves move between different instantiations, which he refers to as animals, monsters, artifacts, spirits, cultural heroes, and shamans. For Barcelos Neto, visual elements in the masks were seen to be far more effective at showing transformation as an ontological notion. That is, features that are that demonstrate characteristics that are themselves fluid and capture a kind of becoming, if you will, that textual sources purely and simply cannot communicate in the same way. Barcelos Neto provides a typology of these masks based on their relationship with specific animals and vegetables, from monkeys and frogs to feather-bearing monsters, also including their material, cotton and palms, and basic geometrical forms. And he moves on to describe the particular visual patterns and symbolic formulas that are described and embodied by these masks. For the Wauja, he concludes, decorated objects have a high degree of agency in the cosmic creative process at the center of their community. At times they turn into animals and travel independently into the forest. At times they merely serve the Wauja as reflections of their own aesthetic efficacy. I think that for us, what these masks do is to open up an alternative ontological space in which forms of representation slide fluidly between one another. taking us away from the all too rigid observer and observed in the context of naturalists or artists and those who populated New World landscapes they were depicting for European eyes. Marcelo Neto's work on the Waja mask follows more broadly a move in Latin American anthropology that has deep implications for how historians interested in visual cultures of the Americas do, or at least I would argue should do, their work. And here I'm thinking of the work of Brazilian anthropologist Viveiros de Castro, who emphasized that Amerindian communities failed to make rigid distinctions between peoples, animals, and spirits within their own cosmology. The stimulus for Viveiros de Castro is, in his words, the numerous references in Amazonian ethnography to an indigenous theory by which the manner in which humans see animals and other subjects that populate the universe, gods, spirits, the dead, meteorological phenomena, vegetables, sometimes even objects, and artifacts. The anthropologist Peter Revere called this universe proposed by Amazonian ontologies a highly transformational world, where spirits, the dead, and shamans assume animal forms, but more broadly, there exists a fluidity between different forms of life. So this is a kind of a broad theoretical, methodological introduction to basically make the argument and a proposition that we not only consider Amerindians as actors in a play of their own making, as revealed through the description that Ferreira gives of the Europishura dance, but that we also see European naturalists and those who accompanied them as implicated in the fluid ontologies, that is to say, the subjective ordering of experience, as proposed by the objects through which the Europishuna and other indigenous groups observe those around them. How might we view Ferreira if we allowed for the possibility that his activities were no less subject to the enthusiasm to which he described the activities of the Europishuna medicine man than those of the dancing Europishuna? And how do objects such as masks and other items collected by proto-anthropologists help us to get at these entangled ontologies? One of the characteristics of the occult life of things, as proposed by Santos Granero, is the invisibility to lay people of the personas of their objects, their anemic character, and their interaction with other social beings, including plants, animals, and spirits. So in addition to taking clues from anthropologists, we historians can also use such scenes of masquerade and observation to think metaphorically about the figurative masks that early modern European actors wore as they represented themselves and others in a new world. Behind what masks of erudition did Ferreira cloak his own perceptions as he floated downstream in his covered cabins? What veils hung over his 18th century eyes as he sought to make order of the natural world that surrounded him? One of the lessons of the Europishuna masks, which themselves contain both figurative painted eyes as well as literal eye holes for the performer, is that ocular and occult practices were intimately related, as their close etymology suggests. Indeed, Rafael Bluto's 1721 Dictionary of the Portuguese Language, which has now been made digitally available at the Biblioteca Brasiliana, made clear that eyes often obscured as much as they revealed. According to Bluto, eye derives from oculus, and oculus from occultus, either because the eye is hidden by the veil of the eyelids, or conversely, because by the light of our eyes, nothing is obscured. Very interesting to play with these 18th century notions of visuality, light, and vision when we're thinking about how it was that they perceived their own observations. 18th century naturalists, observers of what the Abbé Pluche called the spectacle of nature, most often followed Bluto's second definition. preferring to privilege on-the-spot observation and debunking what they considered to be mindless repetition by bookish study. During the period of Fajitas Expedition, the natural historical methodology promulgated in Portugal sought to draw a sharp distinction between bookish knowledge on the one hand and what certain reformist authors called the art of observation. Although Ferreira was born in the Brazilian city of Bahia, he participated in this renovation of the Portuguese university when he arrived in Coimbra, and a new generation of students trained under the Italian naturalist Domenico Vandelli. The innovative curso filosofico put forward by Vandelli signaled a profound transformation in the training of naturalists to reconnoiter Portuguese overseas territories. Vandelli was in regular contact with naturalists throughout Europe, as well as imperial agents stationed in key sites of Portugal's ever-expanding 18th century empire. And here is a map that unfortunately is not particularly clear, but it gives you some sense of all of the philosophical voyages that were carried out by the Portuguese in the 18th century. This is the Fajitas Expedition here. You also had similar expeditions by various agents in the state of Minas Gerais, Rio, here in Bahia, also Angola, Mozambique, and as far away as Goa and Southeast Asia as well. So again, this is a very different kind of outreach, if you will, by the Portuguese that obviously has very strong echoes in terms of their, or rather, it is itself a strong echo of their imperial activities, but there also appear strange places like this one here, which you can't really see this little dot, that is Philadelphia, where at the very tail end of the 18th century, the Portuguese sent an agent to recover as much information as possible on the natural historical environment that he found there. So Vandelli received correspondence and specimens from agents in Mozambique, where the governor Pedro de Saldanha y Albuquerque sent him pictures of a green pigeon and a white parrot that he collected, alongside other ethnographic images of Moors and Kafirs. He received other specimens from Goa throughout the second half of the century. And his detailed instructions to his disciples emphasized how understanding the physical and moral characteristics of native populations was part of a larger project to put agricultural production and human labor to effective use. A project that would be crystallized later in the century with the print shop known as the Arco do Cego, a project that was also highly visual in its orientation. So this is all a way of collecting the kinds of information that would attempt to merge ethnographic data with natural historical data, all with an eye toward helping the Portuguese Empire to make good and effective use of the many natural resources that it had at its disposal. The museum played a crucial role in this broader program. The Coimbra Cabinet and the Ajuda Natural History Museum were not only spaces for the entertainment of the royal family, but also served as one of the prime repositories for new materials from overseas to be collected and displayed. They were spaces in which the spoils from Fajitas Expedition would eventually be brought together. Vandelli himself likened the museums to an open book in which the observer instructs himself easily and with pleasure, and in which memory is aided by the eyes and attention is fixed through the pleasure of sight. Again, connecting these two sensorial experiences of seeing and touching, and then of course with the book and reading as well. The Faculty of Natural Sciences and the Cabinet of Natural History at Coimbra were constructed. There were new buildings that were constructed that soon became filled with birds and butterflies, two-headed cats and alligators, turtles, snakes, corals, shells, and fossils, many of which came in from Portugal's overseas possession, but also, including Brazil, but also the Portuguese possessions of Angola, Mozambique, and others. Now, these principles of vision were very much in evidence on Fajitas' philosophical voyage. His initial exploration took place along the upper and lower arms of the Rio Negro and was divided into 13 segments, or what he called participações, in which he chronicled his observations in extended reports to the captaincy's governors. And there were many different features of these different reports, but one that I wanted to, this is one of the cartographic images that is more or less from the same period. But I wanted to bring attention not necessarily only to these kinds of maps, but also to these, which are called population maps, or mapas de população, that enumerated the indigenous and other residents of the villages to which Fajita traveled, as well as remarks on the kinds of natural products, including indigo, hemp, and fruit trees that could be used to power the colonial and metropolitan economies. These are fascinating documents, and they represent, I argue elsewhere, one of the reasons why 18th century maps become so denuded of ethnographic data and information. Historians of cartography have traditionally argued that it is because of the demographic collapse of indigenous populations in these regions that you don't end up seeing any kind of ethnographic information. What I offer as a kind of an alternate hypothesis, which is not in any way to deny the demographic collapse, is that the information began to appear and be registered in different kinds of documentary forms, both graphically in terms of the ethnographic images that I'm going to show in a moment, but also through these kinds of charts. I think it is not in any way coincidence that they were called mapas de população, because they seem to combine and demonstrate a kind of information that would simply be impossible to demonstrate on a static cartographic document. So we can talk about this a little bit later in the Q&A as well. In the watercolors that accompany the text from his philosophical voyage, images functioned as highly particularized taxonomic views, identifying the cultural and anatomical features of the groups in very specific ways. And here we have an image of the Indio Miranha. Again, what's interesting, you'll see this in a moment with some of these representations, not this one, but I'll just say that there were original drawings that were done in situ, and then the rest of this material was actually done back in Portugal for the most part, in the Casa de Risco, the artistic studio. So again, you have a bit of a disconnect between the representation of what the landscape would in fact be like and the image that is conveyed as part of that. Here you have the Europishunas, who are shown not engaged in their militant dance, as Fajita had observed them, but rather as the exemplars of an eccentric practice of facial scarification. In the report that accompanied this image, Fajita described how they poked their faces with the needles of the pupunia palm and inserted the ashes from its burnt leaves inside their open wounds. This was the aspect that was highlighted in the taxonomic views as well. That is, he froze in time and space a cultural characteristic of this group that may have been eccentric, but that also demonstrated their interactions with and dominion over the products of the forest. Equally particular rituals were observed in the Cambeba Indians, or the Omaguas, who had been associated since early in the 18th century with the custom of flattening their children's foreheads at birth. In the text that accompanied this image, Fajita explains that he had visited with the last member of this nation who still has the flattened forehead, and that this interaction had yielded a host of useful information regarding the rites and ceremonies of the Cambebas. This image was based on these interactions with this individual, Dionisio da Cruz. And Dionisio's right hand holds a long, flat wooden object called the palheta, which was used to launch arrows and which Dionisio demonstrated to him during their exchange. an exchange rather. The Brazilian historian Pono Caminelli has argued that the nomenclature and taxonomic representations of the work of Ferreira function as something of a rich and multifaceted mirror in which Europe was able to project itself as the driving force behind a planetary expansion. I think that this interpretation of Europe's attempting to connect its colonial and scientific ventures is important, but I would also suggest that we can learn more by attempting to understand the ways that other kinds of influences beyond a dominant imperial visuality may have, unwittingly or not, entered into the process, and whether other dynamics were at work that may have been invisible and remain obscure. So what I've been explaining so far relates to the role of observation in Ferreira's natural historical practice and the place of iconography in Ferreira's portrayal of indigenous rituals and technologies. All of these strategies were used by Ferreira in an attempt, which was one of his central goals, to create an iconic, generic portrayal of Homo Americanus, which is for his metropolitan readers. And he used Spanish commentators, including Antonio de Ulloa, Pedro de Cieza de León, also Buffon, Charlevoix, Anson, Dampier, Adam Smith, William Robertson, all of the classic late 18th century climatic thinkers to put together in what in his words would be a certain combination of characteristics and a certain air so primitively theirs that through it the characteristics of an American figure, una figura americana, can be clearly established. Ferreira also collected material objects to make his point, and this will be my final example. I hope this example can serve as something of a launching off point for a discussion about the politics of collecting in a colonial context at the end of the 18th century. These are, let me get to the last. This is an example of what I was saying before about the original, the original portrayal, the original visual representation that then, once it gets back to Portugal, is actually embellished and made into a more significant portrayal. Ferreira was focused around what he called the ability of objects to be able to produce ideas, em português, cheias de mais força e verdade do que todas as descrições mais exatas e as figuras mais perfeitas. That is, ideas that were stronger and full of far more truth than all of the descriptions, the most exact descriptions, and the most precise figures. And so he also collected objects in order to do this, and this is an example of this from the Archivo Histórico Ultramarino, which caught my attention and which I will read in order to close. His Excellency gave me yesterday the head of a tapuia and wished to see whether I could do something with it. Such was my zeal that I immediately went to the palace to say to His Excellency that he had the great pleasure to send to His Majesty's cabinet an object of which there is no sample in any European cabinet. And since neither His Excellency nor I can legitimately delay the arrival of an item like this a single moment longer, it will accompany what was also at hand. Therefore, with the said head goes a set of teeth, several collections of necklaces, bracelets, and feathers, all of which came together with the head in a box, without being able to know anything more about this at the present time. I just received another one of the creatures that are in the cabinet prepared. Since I am nothing more than a missionary of natural history, everyone sends me an animal, someone else a rock, because in the royal cabinet of His Majesty, they tell them that these items will be named after them. In this way, Your Excellency will have many natural products to work on. So this letter from Ferreira brings us crudely, even violently, back to the question of vision, agency, and perspective. The document can be profitably read, I would argue, in the context of an increasing interest in scientific intermediaries or go-betweens. Since Ferreira claims to be a missionary of natural history, but in fact seems less a proselytizer and more like an intermediary, one who sits at the intersection of several competing flows of information and objects. The arrival of this tapuya head, surrounded by trinkets, necklaces, bracelets, feathers, and flowers, brings us forcefully back to the questions we asked of the mask, of cultural patrimony, of ways of seeing, and the role of the human head to represent or to cause to be present certain cultural or spiritual forces that had been inherent in the description and the use of the Yurupishuna. Here I'm thinking about the work in particular of Anne Fabian, who in her book, The Skull Collectors, showed a long trajectory of interest in the human skull that became embroiled in the politics of collecting in a line from Blumenbach reaching through to Louis Agassiz, Samuel George Morton, and beyond. But if we follow Ferreira's letter, we also witness a different series of transformations. First, the head, severed from the body to which it had belonged, in a kind of anti-synagogal substitution, where the decapitated head means something entirely different than the body to which it was once attached. Entirely devoid of identity shorn from its body, other than the trophy factor of an object, unlike any other that had adorned the king's collection, the head is surrounded by other objects, some living, some dead, which gives way textually to another creature to be found in the Lisbon cabinet. The missionary first receives an animal, then a rock, both of which are transformed into names, which in turn name their sender and provide the moniker of missionary to Ferreira, who transforms all of this material into a letter to send to his superior. So I'll end with this description then, because I think that it helps us to think about it, as it catalyzes all of these different stages of transformative thinking on behalf of the colonial power. It brings us back to the masks of the Yurupishuna, as well as the figurative masks or veils of Ferreira's erudition. It asks us to transit between the material, the visual, and the textual at the same time, and to see the extraordinary range of representations that are possible when looking through the eyes of these masks of the Yurupishuna or the masks of the Europeans who observed them in the 18th century. So thanks for your attention.
So much. Can we open for questions, please? Carlos?
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation very much. I especially like this notion of fluid ontologies and the quotation you read from Ferreira about the relationship between the occult and the ocular. But I was particularly intrigued about this quotation about the book as a museum and Ferreira saying, conceptualizing this is something that should be an open book. So and then you asked about the politics of collection. What I want to know is how exactly was that museum, was it at Coimbra, you said, organized, and who was the intended audience for the collection? When were the pieces put together? Is it still there today? So a little bit more about the history of that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm only able to answer partially. I can point you in the direction of some excellent studies about the museum culture more generally in 18th century Portugal. The museum, you basically had two major institutions, which was the museum at Coimbra, which was used in some ways as a kind of imperial collecting museum, but it was also very much a museum of instruction. and the two very much fed off of each other. The idea was that these expeditions would go out, they would retrieve materials, bring them back to be studied, and in turn to instruct the new generation of observers in all of these different things that were coming back from all the parts of the empire. They were largely, as is very commonly known, a Brazilian-born generation that were then trained in Coimbra. Some of them were trained in other places like Montpellier, but this was seen as a way of unifying the Portuguese Empire through an understanding of its natural objects. The other institution, if you will, was the Natural History Cabinet and Ajuda, which was more of a royal institution for, as I mentioned, the entertainment of the royal family. And I don't know to what extent that was open for other people to enjoy. I don't think it was in the same way, for instance, that the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, the Jardin des Plantes, in the 18th century in France was open. But it definitely, it was certainly meant for, it was part of this renovation in the study of the natural sciences, and was organized according to principles that would have been readily recognizable to the 18th century scientific and natural historical community.
Bradley?
So, for him, doesn't seem to have, he seems to be interested in the masks as sort of objects, but he doesn't make an attempt to kind of Levi-Straussian attempt to understand masks as kind of cultural representation or interpretation of the culture. Is that?
Not that I have found in terms of his. I mean, he's not the one text that he really philosophizes. You know, this particular text was a report. I think I have it here. It's known as calls it an oficio. It's the oficio del naturalista, and it's very much in the guise of a kind of a formal official report. The text in which he philosophizes most is one called the Observações Gerais e Particulares, which is really his attempt to bring together all of the readings that he had done in kind of European intellectual history, the history of the Americas, the dispute of the New World, and to try and figure out who this Homo Americanus actually was. He is primarily interested in the pragmatic orientations of the materials that he finds as being, somehow he's not. He doesn't try to put them in relation, and I'm not sure that he even had would have had the training or capacity to do that, at the time. I mean, in a sense, it becomes the raw materials that later, sort of proto-anthropologists who have that comparative ability. This is precisely why the museum ends up being such an important institution, because there had not been a kind of institution that would allow somebody to extrapolate from this sort of artistic representation into a more...
So does somebody, when then in the 19th century, does somebody come along that gets interested then from that other perspective? That is, there's developed ethnography in 19th century Portugal that began learning about regional customs and that sort of thing. I wonder if is there any point where they're part of the colonial project that sort of
gets taken up. I think that what happens is that it quickly splits off from being a kind of a national enterprise to be taken up by different ethnological and museological institutions in Europe and in a place like the United States, and later on in the 19th century. I mentioned Agassiz, as extremely important for the development of in this country in the second half of the 19th century. But as far as creating a kind of a comparative ethnology, I'm not sure, I don't know enough about that Portuguese thinking that way. I haven't really come across, we don't hear about great Portuguese comparative ethnologists in the 19th century. It's mainly Germans who end up coming to Brazil, who are then going back and placing all of these different things in the context of expeditions and materials that they have recovered from other places. Seems to me anyway. I don't know.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up because